A washout, said Julie. A bun fight, said Sky. Revolting, said Hayden. Fantastic, said Chris. A disaster, said Mum. A total disaster. Little Jack didn't say anything at all. He was asleep in his high chair. The soaking wet guests started to leave. The barbecue from hell, Chris heard Slogger Stevens' wife say as she jumped into their car. In the end, Whacker's wife Anne turned off the hose. Mum did the same for Dad. Then she dragged him inside. She gave Dad the biggest lecture ever. Stupid behaviour, she snapped. What an example to set for the children. Good on you, Dad, Chris said. You showed the ratbag a thing or two. You're both immature, I said. Mum looked at Dad and wagged a finger. I want this to be the end of the matter, she told him in a very stern voice. That's what she wanted. But it wasn't what she got. Oh no. What's he going to do? The next morning, Dad went out into the garden. There was a terrible scream. It's gone, he shrieked. It's gone. We all rushed outside. What's gone? Asked Mum. The cabbage. Someone's taken it. Good, said Julie. I hate cabbage. Dad glared at the kids angrily. It wasn't me, I said. Not me, not me, nor me. And it certainly wasn't Jack, said Mum. He can't even walk yet. Look, yelled Chris. Footprints. Dad looked at the fence. Whacker! Screamed Dad. Whacker has nicked my cabbage. He wants revenge. Dad scrambled up the fence and jumped over. Chris followed. They were gone for a long time. When they came back, Dad was red in the face. He stomped into the kitchen and helped himself to 5 meat pies. Then he ate 7 lamingtons, one after the other. Things were looking bad. What happened? I said to Chris. Whacker said he didn't steal the cabbage. Dad called him a liar, so Whacker slammed the door in Dad's face. The war is getting worse. That's silly, I said to Chris. I went out inside to discuss it with Dad, but he wouldn't listen to anyone. Dad, I said, Robin is my best friend and she's his daughter. Too bad, said Dad. I'm having nothing to do with cabbage thieves, and that's that. Several days passed and all was calm. If Dad and Whacker passed each other in the street, they both looked the other way. But Mum and Whacker's wife Anne just talked to each other as if nothing had happened. So did Robin and I. Best friends don't break up just because their fathers are crazy. Then Whacker bought a new dog. A big old thing called Bitzer. Bitzer this and Bitzer that, said Dad. A mongrel, like Whacker. Chris liked Bitzer, but seeing as how it was the dog of the enemy, Chris couldn't really go over the fence and pat it. The real trouble started the next night. Bitzer barked and barked. Every time a possum came out of a tree, Bitzer would start barking. Dad roamed around the house. The slightest whimper would get him out of bed. Ruddy dog, he said. Whacker's doing it on purpose. He's put the dog kennel right down the back of his yard near our place. We get disturbed and he doesn't. Well, I'm not standing for it. Later that night, I was woken up by Chris sneaking out of his bed. Where are you going? I said. Chris held a finger up to his lips. Go back to your bed, he said. We have work to do. I followed him outside and I found Dad in the backyard. What are you up to? I asked. Shh, said Dad. We don't want your mother finding out what's going on. He was carrying a sack in one hand. Have you got the ammo? Said Chris. Dad nodded. He reached into the sack and pulled out a large potato. If I have to stay awake at night, then Wacko does too, he said. Dad threw back his arms and then hurled the potato into the air. Dad is a very good bowler. He once took 8 wickets for 3 runs. He never misses. The potato landed with an enormous thump on Whacker's tin roof. Then it began to roll downward. Wampa, 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 wampa. It's amazing how much noise a spud can make on a tin roof in the middle of the night. The potato came to a stop in Whacker's spouting. Bitzer began to bark like crazy. Chris looked at Dad with deep admiration. Brilliant, Chris said. They really were childish, both of them. At that moment, the windows in Wacker's house filled with light. His back door opened and Wacker came out into the yard dressed in his pyjamas. He stared up at the trees. He didn't know what had made the noise. Dad tried not to laugh. He thinks it's a possum, he said. We crept back inside. Don't turn on the light, said Dad, or he'll know it's us. From now on, if Bitzer wakes up, I wake Wacker up. If Bitzer wakes me up, I wake Wacker up. Dad put an arm around my shoulder. Don't tell your mother, he said. She wouldn't understand. I don't understand either, I said. Wacker and his family are our friends. Enemies, said Chris. Don't forget the cabbage. Every night for the next week, Dad and Chris crept into the backyard and threw potatoes onto Wacker's roof. Wacker kept running out with a torch and searching everywhere, but he didn't see the potatoes because they were stuck in his spouting. In the end, he climbed onto the roof and found all the spuds up there. Right, he yelled into the dark night. It's war, it is. You'll be sorry for this, Johnny boy. 2 nights later, Wacker had a party with the Rotary Club. The noise was terrible. Much worse than our washed-out barbecue, but Dad decided not to throw any more spuds. Not now he's onto us, he said. The next morning, Dad went to get the mail and discovered that someone had vomited into the letterbox. It was all over the letters and Dad had to wipe them clean. It was Wacker, said Dad. He never could hold onto his oysters. I'll get him for this. Yeah, said Chris. I can think of something to do with in their letterbox. No, said Dad, better not. Well, it just went from bad to worse after that. Wacker let down Dad's tyres. Dad rang Wacker up at 3 in the morning and told him off. Wacker lit a fire every time he went into the backyard. Dad rigged his stereo speakers up in the garage wall facing Wacker's windows. Then he put on one of my CDs and turned the volume up full in the middle of the night. He patted me on the head. That'll fix him, said Dad. It's the worst music I've ever heard. Thanks very much, I said. Just then there was a knock on the door. It was a policeman holding a notebook. You can't have music that loud, he said. You're keeping the whole neighbourhood awake. That's the idea, said Chris. It's a war. Mum pulled Chris inside and I rushed over and turned off the music. Dad shut the door so that Mum couldn't hear what was said. After a bit, Dad came inside holding a pink piece of paper. Mum snatched it from his hand. She was furious. A $200 fine for a stupid argument? This has got to stop, she said. I can't live here with all this going on. If you and Wacker can't make friends, we'll have to move. There was dead silence. You couldn't, I said. Yes, I could, said Mum, and she meant it. Well, the last and worst trick came about 2 weeks later. It was over the apple tree. It was huge and old. Every year it grew hundreds of delicious apples. The only problem was half of the branches hung over into Wacker's yard. Normally, Dad let Wacker pick the ones on his side. Not this year, said Dad. No way. You shin up the tree, Chris, and pick all the apples on Wacker's side before he can get them. That's not fair, Dad, I said. Whose side are you on anyway, said Chris. He quickly climbed up the tree and started picking. He had to really stretch out for the ones on Wacker's side. Careful, said Dad. We don't want you falling into his garden. Chris hurried as quickly as he could. If Wacker came out, it would mean big trouble. Soon there were only a few apples left on the furthest branches. Chris can't reach, I said. Tell him to come down. Okay, said Dad. I'll do it myself. Chris scrambled down and Dad struggled up into the tree and started picking. He had quite a hard time of it because his big beer gut kept getting in the way. And he was just reaching out for the last apple when a furious voice roared from the other side of the fence. Get back over your own side, shouted Wacker. They're my apples, said Dad. Like fun they are. The ones on my side are mine, said Wacker. Give them back. Dad grinned triumphantly and flashed those brilliant teeth in a gloating smile. He shook his head. Make me, he said. Wacker was really upset. You could see veins on his head starting to throb. He raced back inside and came back with a saw. "I don't want those branches hanging over my garden," he said. "I think I'll remove them, then I'll burn them off." He started to saw away at a lower branch. Dad leaned down. Quick as a flash, he snatched the saw out of Whacker's hand, then threw the saw down to Chris. It was amazing. I still don't know how he managed it. "You ratbag!" screamed Whacker. He grabbed the end of the half-sawn branch and started pulling on it. He bent it back and back and back, but it wouldn't break. Dad leaned down and mocked him. "Weak," said Dad. Whether his hand slipped or whether he did it on purpose, I couldn't say, but Whacker let go of the branch and it whipped back and smashed and slashed into Dad's face. Whoops. Dad screamed and fell crashing down into Whacker's yard. Chris scrambled over the fence and looked at Dad. He was lying there moaning and groaning. There was blood and broken teeth all over his face. "Geez, I'm sorry, mate," said Whacker. He looked as if he meant it too. Whacker tried to help, but Dad pushed him away. Chris pulled Dad to his feet and helped him stagger back home. Well, Dad was in hospital for 3 days. He had a fractured jaw and lost 10 of his front teeth. Oh, poor Dad. "There's nothing I can do," said the dentist. "They all have to come out." Then he uttered the fateful words. "It's false teeth for you, I'm afraid." Dad groaned and hung his head in his hands. For a moment, I thought he was going to cry. He had just lost his best asset. "We'll get him for this," said Chris. "No, you won't," said Mum. Things went quiet for a whole month. Dad and Chris played no tricks, and neither did Whacker.